أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد لا سيما بقية الله في الأرضين روحي وأرواح العالمين له الفداء اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا. Please recite a salawat. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Today our conversation is going to start off a little strange. I'm going to suggest that each and every one of us, at least most of us, and most of humanity are suffering from a very particular ailment, a kind of a mental ailment. And most of us are suffering from this situation. And if I were to say this, most of you would be astonished because obviously we know ourselves. And when we look at ourselves in the mirrors, we don't see people who are suffering from psychological ailments. But it is a kind of psychological ailment. And not only that, it is cross-cultural, it's universal, it's a true pandemic, and it's something that has existed throughout the ages for a majority of human beings. And strangely enough, most people seem to miss it. Most people seem to be oblivious about it. It is a kind of grand delusion, a communal delusion, in fact, a species-wide delusion. And it's been in humanity, era after era, and it is something that is kind of ingrained into our culture. And the interesting thing is that this is something which is common between the believers and the disbelievers, if you're using the term believers in the general sense as the Qur'an does at many times. It is something that is in America, it's in Europe, it's in Asia, it's in Africa, it's in West Asia, or as the Middle East, as some people call it. In fact, throughout the world. What is this mental illness, to use a harsh word? What is this delusion? I would suggest that this delusion is something of this sort. We, in general, believe that we know how to think. We take it granted that we know how to think. And proof of this matter is that we never really seriously ask God for aql, for a higher level of intellect. We're not really ever worried about learning how to think in the proper fashion. Even some people who are educated and might have studied different types of subjects like logic, etc., they learn methods of thinking which are more traditional in nature. They're more conventional in nature. But they never turn towards religion, they never turn towards God and His book and the Ahlul Bayt to try to see whether our processes of thinking, our system of thought, at the very fundamental level, is it truly what God and the Prophet salawatullah wasalamu alayhi and the Ahlul Bayt want us to have? And as I said, if we introspect, me, myself, and I'm obviously talking about myself, initially I'm talking about myself and obviously about all other people, even the people sitting here without any doubt, in fact. We've never looked into our own souls in the darkness of night, maybe at the early time of dawn, and thought, oh, I really don't know how to think. I don't know how to analyze things. I don't know how to look at the world and see it in the proper light. because I do not have that mental framework. And that in itself is proof. I mean, if we were to just ask ourselves this question right here, right now, how many times have we asked God seriously, in that state of being really humble in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, asked Him to give us aql salim, a proper and steadfast intellect? Never. Almost never. Maybe when we're reciting some of the prayers and by chance there's a word there that says Allahumma razuqna aqlan saliman aw saliman, and we just pass through that because we already have it. It's probably a prayer for other people, to be taken seriously by other people, maybe the disbelievers, because the disbelievers obviously they do not have a framework which is taken from Islam and from Qur'an and from the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. But we never ever looking at ourselves in this light. And that in itself is proof that we are deficient in this regard. Because when the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam in their own prayers ask God for higher levels of intellect, then we who are not even worthy of the dust under their feet, we should be even more serious about this fact. So it is a pandemic. It's a pandemic which has been here from ages and from the beginning of time, in fact, and we don't take it seriously. We don't take it in the manner that we took Corona, and we started creating vaccinations and then forcing people to get those vaccinations. And the interesting thing is that the vaccination for this particular disease has been sent by God Himself. It was the first vaccination created for a species-wide disease. And that vaccination, initially and in the most fundamental sense, is the Holy Qur'an. And obviously, the words of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, because these two cannot be separated from one another. But the fundamental constitution of Islam, the fundamental document of Islam, with that particular nature that that book has, is the Holy Qur'an. And if you look at it from this light, as we will inshallah briefly through during this conversation, we will see how the Qur'an works to rectify and correct this intellectual problem that we all have. So step number one is to realize that we all have this problem. Many times when we are listening to speeches by the ulama, I'm obviously not a scholar in that sense, but when we're sitting in front of true ulama and we're listening to them, we commonly kind of deflect all of these issues towards other people. So we listen to them about tyranny and oppression, and we're never ever looking at ourselves. We're looking at other people, right? We're never looking at that small circle of influence that we have and where we might be the tyrants. I mentioned in the last speech that I had here, I think Ayatollah Jawadi Amoli, he said to a caravan that was going to Palestine in support of the Palestinian people, he said that if you want to fight the Israel that exists on the geopolitical scene, then you must start by fighting the Israel that exists within your own soul. Because Israel is transgression. It is transgression manifested, personified, which has come into being and embodied in the shape of a illegitimate state. And that is why the forces of Western new barbarism, Tawahush Gharbi as Imam Khomeini called it, they support this system because they want transgression, transgression against God, transgression against essential human values, transgression against a steadfast intellect which dictates that God be worshipped. They want this sort of transgression to become established within society, to become the norm. So when we resist Israel, when we resist the illegitimate Zionist state, we are resisting this fundamental change within worldwide culture. Some people kind of degrade this whole issue into a simple political tussle between nations or ethnicities. No, it is a fight for the very nature of the human soul, the very purity of the human intellect. So, as I said, step number one, look at ourselves. Now, step number 2. Why is a steadfast and pure intellect important? If we study the Qur'an and if we study the initial chapters of Usul al-Kafi, we will understand that the intellect has been created for the purpose of allowing us to worship God. And worshipping God is the only and exclusive path towards perfection of our own humanity, of our existential essence. So without a working and a proper intellect, without having a proper framework of thought, without having the proper tools for thinking correctly, we cannot achieve proper worship. And when we do not achieve proper worship, we are deficient in our move towards divine grace, towards that comprehensive prosperity that God has promised us. So, point number 2, we need a proper working intellect in order to worship God, in order to be able to achieve comprehensive and holistic prosperity and success, which is, in fact, finafillah. So, now that we understand the importance of this issue, let us come back and see what point number 3 is. I'm trying to be very brief today because last time I kind of overstepped the time limit. Point number 3 is to understand how our intellect is corrupted. Cool. Now, this doesn't take some special environment. It doesn't take for you to be living in the West in that polluted social and cultural environment. Even within our most holiest cities, when we are born, we, according to the Quran, we are empty in terms of knowledge. Yes, we have certain basic programming, which is fitri, which is based upon our nature, that allows us to continue our existence in order to achieve the following steps that God has planned for us. But in terms of knowledge, we are empty, as the Quran testifies. And as we grow older, we learn essential values. As the Ahl Bayt alayhimus salam in their narrated traditions, they speak of the first 7 years to be the formative years of every child. In those 7 years, the essential values of the mind are created. And they are learned most of the time, in the large bulk of it, they are learned through seeing how their parents, their siblings, their fellows, their other children around them, and society in general is behaving. These values, they become the essential operating system of the mind. So, as an example, if a human being believes that stealing is something bad, right? But the amount of negative value that this has inside his psychology is less than the positive value of gaining some sort of interest, even if it is through illegitimate means. This internalized value system, at a certain point of time, will cause him to make wrong decisions, him or her to make wrong decisions. So, a more practical example. When we've had a late night, we've been out for cultural issues, maybe for mubahisa because we are here in Qom, or we've had classes, or we were teaching classes online. Anyway, we had a very late night. We were up till maybe 2 a.m. in the morning. Now, we know that Salatul Layl, because obviously I won't assume that Salatul Fajr gets qaza for any of the brothers, but we know that Salatul Layl is something that is highly recommended in Islam. Tahajjud, as brothers and sisters call it. We know that it is highly recommended in Islam. And then the consequences that the Ahl Bayt have defined for this prayer, this particular namaz, are immense in terms of the spiritual risk, the spiritual sustenance. One of those things is the intellect and the growth of the intellect. In terms of these things, it is very important. The ulama say, if you want the world, Salatul Layl. If you want the hereafter, Salatul Layl. So everything is in that treasure hold. So obviously, in every religious man's and woman's mind, Salatul Layl is a positive value. Performing Salatul Layl is a proverb of value.